Have you ever been treated as if you were incapable just for being young? As if you knew nothing? As if your opinion didn't matter because you look like a child? Today, I'm going to tell you the true story of a 19-year-old girl who entered a courtroom full of lawyers in 5,000 real suits, was humiliated because everyone thought she was an intern, heard that she should go back to college and stop playing lawyer, and an hour later won a 5 million reais case that no experienced lawyer had been able to win. And you know what's most impressive? She wasn't from a rich family. She didn't study at a private school. She had no connections. She was the daughter of a cleaning lady from the outskirts of São Paulo who graduated in law at 19, being the youngest in the history of the college. And when everyone laughed at her in court, she proved that knowledge has no age, no color, no social class. Stay until the end, because I'm going to show you how she won, how she used that victory to transform the lives of hundreds of people in her community, and the devastating phrase she said to the judge who had mocked her. Prepare your heart, because this story is powerful. Let's go. It was a rainy morning in São Paulo, the kind of fine, persistent rain that makes the city streets even more chaotic, with cars honking impatiently and pedestrians running with broken umbrellas trying to protect themselves from the icy water falling from the grey sky. In the city centre, the João Mendes Forum, known for housing the most complex and controversial cases in São Paulo's justice system, was more bustling than usual. At the entrance of the imposing old-style building, security guards searched lawyers and citizens who constantly came and went. Inside the courthouse, courtroom number 7 was especially crowded. It was a case that had attracted attention, a class action lawsuit against InvestPro, a large investment company accused of fraud against low-income investors. The tension was palpable. Lawyers wearing expensive Italian suits exchanged calculated murmurs and analyzed thick documents in genuine leather folders. In the center of the room, seated in his position of absolute authority, was the learned judge Armando Tavares, a 63-year-old man known throughout the São Paulo judicial system for his extremely rigid posture, his legendary impatience with anything that deviated from formal protocol, and his reputation for not tolerating amateurism. He had an intimidating presence that filled the room. Completely grey hair, impeccably combed back with imported gel, thick-rimmed German designer glasses that cost more than a minimum wage, and a facial expression that seemed to be permanently furrowed, betraying his natural and profound skepticism regarding human nature. It was into this charged, tense, and formal atmosphere that Júlia Rafael entered. She could not have stood out more violently from the others present in the courtroom. She was a visibly thin young black woman, only 19 years old, short at 5 feet 5 inches, wearing a simple grey women's suit that was clearly not expensively tailored, a basic white blouse, and a pair of low-heeled shoes that were already visibly worn at the sides. She carried a black fabric backpack that looked heavy, but which she held firmly against her right shoulder. Despite the stark simplicity of her appearance, amidst that sea of luxury and ostentation, Júlia held her head high with dignity and her posture erect like a ballerina, refusing to bend her spine even under the weight of the stairs. Eyes immediately turned to her. First morbid curiosity, then visible confusion. Finally, condescending smiles. "Who is this girl?" someone murmured loudly enough to be heard. "She must be an intern at some office," another replied with barely disguised disdain. "What an absurdity to bring a child to court," a middle-aged woman commented, shaking her head. Júlia walked with firm, measured steps to a bench at the back of the room and sat down with her spine straight, completely ignoring the curious glances and malicious comments that swirled around her like irritating flies. She carefully opened her backpack and began to organize her documents on her lap, checking each page with meticulous attention. Shortly after, Judge Armando Tavares banged the wooden gavel forcefully. the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot, calling the audience to order. His deep voice resonated with absolute authority in the immediately silent environment. Let's begin the hearing for case number 4578/2023, a class action lawsuit filed by several investors against InvestPro, Gestão de Investimentos Letta, accused of fraudulent practices and aggravated fraud. I request the immediate presence of the lawyer representing the plaintiff, the injured investors. For a tense moment, there was absolute silence in the room. Everyone present looked around, searching for someone to stand up. Then, to everyone's surprise and the shock of many, Júlia Raphael slowly rose from the back seat. With firm, calculated steps, she walked down the central aisle of the room toward the podium. With each step she took, the murmurs grew progressively louder and more incredulous. When she finally reached the podium designated for lawyers, she placed her simple backpack on the floor beside her, arranged her papers on the polished wooden table, and said in a surprisingly firm and clear voice that cut through the air like a blade, "Good morning, Your Excellency. My name is Júlia Raphael da Silva, and I am the lawyer representing the 32 investors harmed in this case." The room instantly erupted. Muffled laughter echoed off the walls. Looks of utter disbelief were exchanged between experienced lawyers. A woman in the front row literally covered her mouth with her hand to avoid laughing out loud. Judge Tavares himself stopped flipping through his papers and slowly raised his eyes above his expensive glasses to observe the young woman standing at the podium. He tilted his head to the side like a confused bird examining something strange, adjusted his glasses by pushing them with his index finger, and looked at Júlia with a mixture of genuine astonishment and deep disdain that he didn't even try to hide. "Excuse me. Are you seriously saying that you are the lawyer for the injured investors in this case?" He paused dramatically. "This is a real court hearing, young lady. We're not in a university extension project or a mock trial at law school. Where is the real lawyer responsible for this case?" Júlia remained absolutely calm, her posture not changing an inch. Her tone of voice was controlled and professional. "Your Honor, I am the lawyer responsible for this case. I am duly registered with the OAB, Brazilian Bar Association, and present here to represent my clients as required by Brazilian law." Judge Tavares let out a short, dry, cruel laugh that quickly turned into pure sarcasm. This can only be some kind of very bad joke. He looked around the room, seeking support and complicity in the equally perplexed and amused expressions of those present. Who was the irresponsible person who gave permission for this child to come in here pretending to be a lawyer? He banged his gavel angrily. "Come on, girl, enough of this nonsense. This isn't an amusement park for you to play at being a lawyer. Go back to college and study a few more years before trying to fool a serious court." At that critical moment, a frail but determined voice emerged from the back of the room. It was Dona Teresa Santos, a 72-year-old black woman, thin, wearing a simple flowered dress and a shawl over her shoulders. She stood up with difficulty, leaning on a wooden cane, and said with a voice trembling with emotion but firm in conviction, "She is my lawyer, Your Honor. She was the one who agreed to defend us when nobody, absolutely nobody else wanted to." When all the expensive offices slammed the door in our faces, Judge Tavares narrowed his eyes dangerously, clearly very annoyed by the situation, which was completely spiraling out of his control. He banged his gavel 3 times in succession to silence the growing murmurs filling the room, and addressed Júlia in an authoritative voice. "Miss Raphael, immediately present your credentials and documentation proving your qualification to practice law. Otherwise, I will end this hearing right now and apply the appropriate penalties for contempt of court." Júlia nodded calmly, showing no nervousness or intimidation. She bent down with precise movements, opened her black fabric backpack, and carefully removed a sealed official brown envelope. She walked with firm steps to the court officer near the judge's desk and handed the envelope directly to him. The officer took the document to Judge Tavares. The room fell completely silent, with absolutely everyone present attentively observing every movement, every breath. The sound of rain hitting the courtroom windows could be heard, the creaking of the old wooden chairs when someone moved, the discreet clinking of the expensive jewelry worn by the lawyers. When the judge opened the sealed envelope with a silver letter opener and began to review the official documents inside, his facial expression gradually changed. First, he remained skeptical, then became serious and focused, and finally, genuinely surprised. He spent several minutes analyzing each page, checking stamps, verifying signatures, examining authenticity seals. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as it awaited the final verdict of that tense moment. "Well, from what I'm seeing here in these official documents," he finally said aloud, "you are indeed a duly licensed lawyer registered with the Brazilian Bar Association São Paulo section. Everything is registered, authenticated, and apparently in perfect legal order." He paused heavily and looked at Júlia over his designer glasses with an expression that mixed surprise and lingering suspicion. "But I need you to explain something to me, Miss Raphael. How exactly did someone your age, who barely seems to have left high school, manage to graduate in law and pass the OAB exam? That's absolutely not common. In fact, it's practically impossible." Júlia was not intimidated by the question laden with innuendo. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air, and replied in a voice that echoed clearly throughout the room. "Your Honor, my mother always taught me from a young age that with genuine effort, absolute dedication, and unwavering focus, absolutely anything is possible in this life. I began studying law at the age of 14 through a special program for gifted young people at the University of São Paulo. I studied tirelessly every day for 5 years. I passed all the necessary exams. I rigorously fulfilled all the legal requirements. And I'm here today in this court not to discuss my age or my personal academic trajectory, but to ensure that my clients, 32 humble people who were cruelly deceived and robbed, receive the justice they deserve and that Brazilian law guarantees." Judge Tavares frowned deeply, visibly challenged and uneasy by the unwavering confidence and impressive articulation of this young woman whom he was sure he could easily intimidate. He drummed his fingers on the mahogany table for a few tense seconds, creating a rhythmic sound that echoed in the silence, clearly thinking about how to proceed. Finally, he sighed loudly and declared, "Very well, Miss Raphael, since you insist so much, and your documents do indeed seem to be all in order, I will allow you to continue. But know from the outset that I will make absolutely no concessions or have any kind of special tolerance because of your extremely young age or any other personal circumstance. I expect absolute professionalism, profound technical knowledge, and solid legal argumentation. I will not accept amateurism in this court. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Honor," Júlia replied with a slight, respectful nod. She calmly returned to the podium, meticulously organized her papers in the order she needed, and took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself for the battle that was about to begin. Eyes were still fixed on her, some with persistent disdain, others with growing surprise, a few with genuine curiosity. The InvestPro lawyer, Dr. Patricia Andrade, a 48-year-old woman with perfectly brushed blonde hair, a beige Chanel suit that cost 15,000 reais, a black Prada bag on the table, and impeccable red nails, observed Júlia with a thin, condescending smile on her matte red painted lips. She clearly didn't see that girl as a real threat. Julia knew exactly what everyone was thinking. She knew that no one in that room believed she was capable. But Julia also knew something they didn't. She had studied that case for 347 hours over the past 2 months. She knew every comma, every paragraph, every legal loophole. And she was about to prove to everyone there that underestimating her would be the biggest mistake they could make. With formal permission granted by Judge Armando Tavares, Julia Rafael carefully arranged her papers on the polished wooden lectern, maintaining her absolutely firm and professional posture despite the overwhelming pressure she felt on her shoulders. The room was still filled with low murmurs and skeptical glances that pierced her like invisible arrows, but she seemed completely immune to any external distraction. The case she was defending was extremely delicate and technically complex. 32 low-income investors, mostly residents of the outskirts of São Paulo, had been systematically deceived by InvestPro, a seemingly reputable investment management company that had promised guaranteed monthly returns of 15% through a supposedly revolutionary cryptocurrency investment fund. Julia began her presentation with a surprisingly clear, objective, and technically precise voice that immediately drew attention. Your Honor, members of this learned court present, I am here today representing 32 honest and hard-working Brazilian citizens who have dedicated their entire lives to hard work, family, and building a better future. These people saved penny by penny for years, some for entire decades, trusting that one day they could have financial security and dignity in old age. She paused for calculated emphasis. InvestPro, the defendant in this case, criminally exploited this trust, this vulnerability, and this legitimate hope to implement a fraudulent scheme that resulted in the theft of 5,200,000 reais from these investors. Julia firmly held up a document she had previously set aside in her meticulous organization. This document I have in my hands is the official prospectus that InvestPro distributed in the peripheral communities of São Paulo, promising in an absolutely irresponsible and fraudulent manner guaranteed monthly returns of 15%. She began distributing certified copies of the document to the judge and the defense, calmly and professionally explaining each technical detail she found. Anyone with basic knowledge of the financial market knows that returns of 15% per month are mathematically unsustainable and clearly characterize a financial pyramid scheme, also known as a Ponzi scheme. She cited with surgical precision the specific articles of the Brazilian Civil Code, the Corporations Law, and the CVM, Brazilian Securities and Exchange Commission, regulations related to investment fraud, demonstrating a technical knowledge that impressed even the most experienced lawyers present in the room. She presented meticulously organized documentary evidence showing that InvestPro did not have legal authorization from the Securities and Exchange Commission to raise public investment, that the alleged cryptocurrency funds never actually existed, and that investors' money was diverted to the personal accounts of the company's partners. As Julia presented each point of her argument, her exposition was absolutely clear, precise, and technically impeccable. She did not use unnecessary legalese or complicated words just to impress, but managed to be technically proficient enough to demonstrate a deep understanding of the subject matter. Even those lawyers who had initially smiled disdainfully when she introduced herself were now beginning to pay serious attention, some even taking notes on what she was saying. Besides all that, Your Honor, she continued, holding up another set of carefully organized documents. Here are independent expert reports prepared by 3 different forensic accounting audit firms. All 3 reports, conducted completely independently without communication between them, reached the same irrefutable conclusion. The accounting records presented by InvestPro contain serious irregularities, clear evidence of data manipulation and unequivocal indications of money laundering through offshore shell companies. Judge Tavares, who at the beginning of the hearing could barely conceal his disdain and impatience, now leaned visibly forward in his leather chair, genuinely attentively examining the documents Júlia presented. For the first time since the beginning of the hearing, he seemed to be taking this young lawyer completely seriously. He gestured with his hand, indicating that he wanted to personally examine the expert reports. The court officer took the documents from Júlia and carried them to the judge's desk. While Judge Tavares reviewed the technical reports page by page, Júlia remained standing at the podium, her posture erect, her hands resting lightly on the wooden table, her breathing controlled, waiting patiently. The confidence emanating from her was not youthful arrogance or presumption. It was the solid confidence of someone who had meticulously done her homework and knew exactly what she was talking about. After several minutes of silently analyzing the expert reports, Judge Tavares finally raised his eyes and made a formal gesture to Investpro's defense attorney. Dr. Patricia Andrade, the defense now has the opportunity to speak and present a rebuttal to what has been presented so far by the plaintiff. Patricia Andrade rose with calculated and elegant movements, adjusting her expensive Chanel blazer before walking to the podium with the confidence of someone who had 3 decades of experience in court and had never lost a single financial fraud case. She cast a quick, visibly condescending glance in Júlia's direction before addressing the judge in a velvety professional voice. Your Honor, with all due respect to this learned court, I must express my concern about the arguments we have just heard. She made a perfectly calculated theatrical pause. Although Ms. Raphael proved remarkably articulate for someone of such a young age and experience, the central issue we are debating here involves extremely complex nuances of financial law, capital markets, and international regulations on crypto assets. She walked slowly around the available space, gesturing with her hands, which had perfectly manicured red nails. These are issues that demand not only theoretical knowledge acquired from university textbooks, but mainly many years of practical experience dealing with real cases of high technical complexity. With all due respect, she looked directly at Júlia with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We must ask ourselves if Ms. Raphael truly understands the technical complexity of this case deeply, or if we are witnessing a well-rehearsed but fundamentally superficial presentation. The insinuation was clear and cruel. She was questioning not only the evidence presented by Júlia, but her own intellectual capacity and professional competence. The attention of the entire room was fixed on that confrontation between the experienced, wealthy lawyer and the young newcomer from the periphery. Judge Tavares watched attentively, clearly interested in seeing how Júlia would respond to that direct attack. Júlia remained standing, completely still, controlling the intense emotions that bubbled within her chest like lava. She knew that tactic very well. It wasn't the first time they had tried to disqualify her by attacking her age, her experience, her credibility. She had faced this her whole life, in school when she was the only black student, in college when she was the youngest by 5 years, and now there in court representing people who trusted her when no one else wanted to help. Your Honor, Júlia began her response in a controlled voice, but full of visible determination. May I request permission to respond directly to the argument presented by the distinguished defense attorney? The judge nodded. You may proceed, Miss Raphael. Thank you, Your Honor. Júlia turned slightly to look Patricia Andrade directly in the eyes. I deeply respect Dr. Patricia's experience and professional trajectory. I recognize that she possesses decades of legal practice that I obviously have not yet had the opportunity to accumulate. She paused briefly. However, this case is not fundamentally about experience or age. It is about concrete facts, irrefutable documentary evidence, and the correct application of Brazilian law. The evidence I have presented to this court is not personal opinion or subjective interpretation. It is technical expert reports prepared by internationally recognized independent companies, authenticated official documents, and accounting data that speak for themselves. Júlia walked to her backpack, took out another document, and held it up for everyone to see. Furthermore, I would like to add to the proceedings this technical opinion prepared by Professor Dr. Marcelo Santana, considered one of the leading Brazilian authorities on financial crimes and corporate fraud. A tenured professor at the USP Law School and former director of the CVM. He meticulously analyzed the entire InvestPro scheme and categorically concluded that it constitutes the crime of aggravated fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, with penalties that can reach 20 years of imprisonment. The impact was immediate and visible. Murmurs of astonishment echoed through the room. Patricia Andrade visibly paled beneath her expensive makeup. Judge Tavares leaned even further forward, clearly surprised. An opinion from Professor Marcelo Santana carried enormous institutional weight in the Brazilian legal world. Júlia continued her argument with increasing momentum, feeling she had finally captured the court's genuine attention. Your Honor, this case transcends merely technical or academic issues of financial law. She paused, her words gaining weight through calculated emotion. We are talking about 32 human beings. Mrs. Teresa Santos, 72 years old, who worked for 40 years as a domestic servant and invested her life savings of 120,000 reais in InvestPro, believing she would finally have security for her retirement. She pointed to Mrs. Teresa, who was sitting at the back of the room, tears silently streaming down her wrinkled face. We are talking about Mr. Joaquim Oliveira, a retired bus driver, 68 years old, who sold his only property and invested 200,000 reais because InvestPro promised that in 2 years he would have enough money to pay for his wife's cancer treatment. She pointed to a white-haired gentleman wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. We are talking about Mrs. Aparecida Lima, 54 years old, who works as a street vendor and invested 30,000 reais that she had saved for her daughter's college education. Júlia's voice gained emotional intensity, but remained technically controlled. These people are not numbers on a spreadsheet, Your Honor. They are honest Brazilian citizens who were systematically deceived by criminals who took advantage of their vulnerability, their lack of formal financial education, and their legitimate dreams of a better life. She turned directly to Judge Tavares. And with all due respect, Your Honor, the fundamental question this court needs to answer today is not whether I have sufficient experience or the appropriate age to be here. The question is, will the Brazilian justice system protect the vulnerable, or will it allow fraudulent companies to continue stealing the hard-earned money of honest workers? The silence that followed was profound and heavy. Even Patricia Andrade seemed momentarily speechless. Judge Tavares rested his chin thoughtfully on one hand, his eyes fixed on Júlia with an expression that had completely changed since the beginning of the hearing. There was no longer disdain. There was respect. Miss Raphael, he finally said in a softer voice, in my 38 years as a magistrate, I have rarely seen an argument so technically well-founded and at the same time so humanly touching. Your evidence is solid, your legal arguments are impeccable, and your passion for justice is evident. He paused significantly. However, before making my decision, I need to hear the defense specifically respond to the fraud allegations and the expert evidence presented. He looked at Patricia Andrade. Dr. Patricia, how does the defense explain the accounting irregularities pointed out by 3 independent auditing firms? How does it explain the lack of authorization from the CVM? How does it explain that the promised investment funds never existed? Patricia Andrade stood up again, but now her previous confidence had visibly diminished. She nervously adjusted her glasses. "Your Honor, there were indeed some administrative irregularities that we acknowledge, but to characterize them as intentional fraud is an exaggeration. InvestPro always intended to regularize its situation with the competent authorities." Julia raised her hand, asking permission to intervene. The judge nodded. "Your Honor, may I demonstrate that this statement from the defense does not correspond to the facts?" She opened her laptop and projected onto the courtroom screen a series of internal emails from InvestPro that she had obtained through a previous court order. These emails, between the company's partners, dated 6 months before the scheme collapsed, show that they were fully aware that they were operating illegally. In one of them, the majority partner writes verbatim, "We need to raise another 5 million before the CVM, Brazilian Securities and Exchange Commission, discovers and shuts down our operation." The room erupted in murmurs. Patricia tried to object. "Your Honor, the origin of these emails needs to be questioned. How did a newly graduated lawyer gain access to confidential internal communications?" Julia calmly replied, "Through a court order duly granted by the criminal court investigating the case in parallel. Everything is absolutely legal and within the correct procedural steps. Here is the court decision that authorized access." She handed the document to the officer. Judge Tavares quickly reviewed and confirmed. "The documentation is in order. The emails are admissible as evidence." Patricia Andrade was visibly losing ground. She tried one last card. "Your Honor, even if there are irregularities, InvestPro is willing to negotiate a settlement with the investors. We can return 50% of the invested amount in installments over 5 years. The judge looked at Julia. "What is the plaintiff's position regarding this settlement proposal?" Julia did not hesitate. "Absolutely unacceptable, Your Honor. My clients don't want 50%. They want 100% of what they invested, plus inflation adjustment interest and damages. And they want this not in 5 years, but immediately through the judicial seizure of the assets of InvestPro's partners." She held up another document. "Your Honor, anticipating this possibility, I requested and obtained a preliminary injunction from another court ordering the seizure of all assets in the names of the company's 3 partners. 2 luxury apartments in Morumbi valued at 3 million each, 5 imported vehicles, a speedboat and bank accounts with a total balance of 1,200,000 reais. Adding it all up, we have 8,400,000 reais in blocked assets, more than enough to fully reimburse the 5,200,000 reais owed to the investors." The room was in total shock. Even Judge Tavares seemed impressed by Julia's level of preparation. She had anticipated every move of the defense, every argument, every attempt to delay or minimize. "Miss Raphael," the judge said with genuine respect in his voice, "how many hours did you dedicate to preparing this case?" 347 hours in the last 2 months, Your Honor," Julia replied without hesitation. "I studied every document, every applicable law, every relevant case law, because I knew that if I came to this court without being absolutely prepared, my clients would lose their only chance at justice, and I wasn't going to allow that to happen." Judge Tavares nodded slowly. "I will decree a 30-minute recess to analyze all the evidence presented before delivering my decision." He banged the gavel and left the room. During the break, several lawyers approached Julia to greet her. Some who had laughed at her at the beginning now looked at her with evident respect. Donna Teresa came to her and hugged her, crying, "You are an angel that God placed in our path, my daughter." When the judge returned, the room fell into absolute silence. After meticulously analyzing all the documentary evidence presented, the expert reports, the technical opinions, the email evidence, and the history of irregularities of the defendant company, he began, This court has reached the following decision. He looked directly at the representatives of InvestPro. I find the collective action brought by the 32 investors to be entirely justified. I condemn InvestPro and its partners jointly and severally to the immediate payment of 5,200,000 reais, referring to the principal invested, plus monetary correction, default interest, and moral damages in the amount of 500,000 reais, to be divided among the victims. The room erupted in emotional applause. Dona Teresa fell to her knees, crying. Other investors embraced each other in tears. Júlia remained standing, emotional but maintaining professional composure, but the judge was not yet finished. Furthermore, he continued, I order the immediate forwarding of a complete copy of this case file to the Public Prosecutor's Office for criminal investigation of the crimes of fraud, money laundering and conspiracy. And I also order a copy to be sent to the Brazilian Bar Association for investigation of the unethical conduct of the defense attorney who, it became evident, had full knowledge of the frauds and yet attempted to defend the indefensible. Patricia Andrade turned pale. Finally, the judge looked directly at Júlia and said something no one expected. Miss Raphael, I need to make a public apology to you. When you entered this room today, I judged you by your appearance, your age, by prejudices I didn't even know I carried. I thought you lacked ability. I thought it was a joke. And I was profoundly wrong. His voice became emotional. You gave me today one of the greatest lessons of my career, that justice has no age, no color, no social class. You possess knowledge, dedication, and courage. You have honored the Brazilian legal profession and reminded me why I became a judge. Thank you. The entire room rose in spontaneous applause. Júlia, finally allowing her emotions to overflow, let a few tears fall as she thanked everyone with a nod. But Júlia Raphael's story didn't end there in that courtroom. That victory was just the beginning of something much bigger. In the following days, the story of the 19-year-old lawyer who won a $5 million case against a fraudulent company began circulating on social media and in the media. Reports highlighted not only the legal victory, but Júlia's inspiring journey. The daughter of a cleaning lady from the outskirts of the city, a public school student who graduated in law at 19 and decided to use her knowledge to defend the most vulnerable. Messages began to arrive by the thousands. Young people from all over Brazil wrote, telling how inspired they felt. Júlia, I'm also from the outskirts of the city, and everyone says I'll never be able to be a lawyer because I don't have money for private college. But seeing you, I believe it's possible, wrote a 15-year-old girl. But what truly transformed Júlia's life and that of her community was what she decided to do with the repercussions of the case. 2 weeks after winning in court, Júlia sought out Dona Teresa and the other investors who had been victims of the fraud. Dona Teresa, your money will be fully returned according to the court decision, she explained, but I wanted to propose something additional. During the process, I studied in depth how these frauds work and realized that the problem isn't just punishing the criminals. The problem is that our community lacks financial literacy. That's why we are easy targets. She then presented her plan. I'm going to create a project called Finances for All. I'm going to give free financial literacy classes in the community. I'm going to teach how real investing works, how to identify fraud, how to save, how to invest safely, and I'm going to do this using simple language without complicated economic jargon. Dona Teresa hugged Júlia tightly. This will help so many people, my daughter. The project started small, with classes on Saturdays in the community church hall. Júlia taught basic concepts, the difference between saving and investing, how the stock exchange works, what Treasury Direct is, how to calculate interest, how to make a family budget. The first class had 23 people, the second had 57, the third had 112. The news spread. In 3 months, Júlia was teaching more than 300 people every week. She created simple teaching materials, partnered with banks to open free digital accounts for students, and brought in expert finance speakers. One of the students in the project was Carlos, a 22-year-old who worked as an app delivery driver. "Júlia, before your classes, I spent everything I earned. Nothing was left over. Now I save 300 reais a month and already have 2,000 invested in Treasury Direct. It's not much, but it's mine. And for the first time in my life, I feel in control of my money." Another student was Seu Manuel, a 58-year-old taxi driver. "I thought investing was only for the rich. I thought I would never understand these things. But you taught in a way that even I understood. Now I know where my money is. I know how much it's earning. I know that when I retire, I'll have something." The project grew so much that it caught the attention of a large financial institution that offered sponsorship. With the money, Júlia was able to hire other financial educators, expand to other communities, and create an online platform with free courses. In 1 year, Finanças para Todos, Finance for All, had already directly impacted more than 5,000 people. But Júlia didn't abandon her legal practice. She continued taking cases for low-income people who had been victims of financial fraud, charging symbolic fees or working pro bono. In 2 years, she had already won 12 similar cases, recovering more than 15 million reais for misguided investors. Her win rate was 100%. Júlia's reputation grew so much that large law firms began making million-dollar offers for her to join them. "Júlia, you can earn 10 times more working with us than doing this community work," said a partner from a famous firm. She politely replied, "I appreciate the offer, but my work isn't about how much I earn. It's about how many people I help." 3 years after that historic hearing at the João Mendes Forum, Júlia Rafael, at 22 years old, had become one of the most respected lawyers in São Paulo in the area of consumer protection and financial fraud. But she never forgot where she came from. She still lived in the same community. She still taught free classes every Saturday. She still handled cases for people who couldn't afford expensive lawyers. One afternoon, Júlia received an unexpected invitation. Judge Armando Tavares asked to meet her in his office. When she arrived, he greeted her with a genuine smile, very different from the skeptical expression of 3 years ago. "Miss Rafael, or should I call you Dr. Júlia now?" he began. "I invited you here because the Court of Justice is organizing a mentoring program for young lawyers from underprivileged communities, and I would like you to be the coordinator of the program." Júlia was surprised and honored. "But why me, Your Honor?" "Because you represent what justice should be," he replied, "accessible, fair, and committed to those who need it most. You proved that the place for young black and poor people is also here in the courts defending rights." Júlia accepted. The program was launched 6 months later, and in 2 years it had already trained 42 new lawyers from the outskirts of the city who, inspired by Júlia, decided to use the law as a tool for social transformation. Dona Teresa, now 75 years old, attended the graduation of the first class. She hugged Júlia with tears in her eyes. "Do you remember that day in court when everyone laughed at you?" "I remember, Dona Teresa," Júlia replied. "I wanted to tell you something. That day, when you entered that room with your head held high, even though everyone looked at you as if you were worthless, I thought, this girl is different. She'll go far, and look where you've arrived." Júlia smiled. "I got here because you believed in me when nobody else did, because you gave me the chance to prove my worth." Years later, in a television interview, Júlia was asked about that moment in court. "How did you feel when the judge and all the lawyers laughed at you?" Júlia thought for a moment before answering. "I felt exactly as I had felt my whole life, underestimated. But I had learned something important. When people underestimate you, they lower their guard, and then you have the chance to surprise them. So I used that underestimation to my advantage. I let them think I knew nothing, and when it was my turn to speak, I showed them everything I had studied. She paused. But the most important thing wasn't winning the case. It was what came after. It was realizing that I could use my knowledge to transform the lives of hundreds, thousands of people. It was creating the financial education project. It was opening doors for other young people like me. That was the real victory. And do you have any message for young people watching who are underestimated every day? Yes, Julia looked directly at the camera. If you are young, if you are black, if you are poor, if you are a woman, if you are from the outskirts of the city, and people say you are not capable, that you won't succeed, that your place isn't there, prove them wrong. Not with anger, but with knowledge. Study. Prepare yourself. Be better than they expect. And when your chance comes, show what you are capable of. Because the system was designed to exclude us, but knowledge is the tool that breaks down any barrier. Today, Júlia Rafael is considered one of the 100 most influential lawyers in Brazil. Her Finances for All project has already impacted more than 50,000 people. She has recovered more than 80 million reais for victims of fraud. And it all started with a 19-year-old girl entering a courtroom where no one believed in her. Have you ever been underestimated? Have they ever told you that you weren't capable? Comment below your story. Share it with someone who needs to see that it's possible. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. The transformation is real. You just need to believe and work hard. See you in the next video.